Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Well, welcome to the show, and I'm very excited today because we have Jason Moore on the show. So Jason Moore is the founder of Elite HRV. Jason designed and implemented large-scale information systems for oil and gas industries. And during this time, he was a coach and I believe a personal trainer as well for health, fitness and sport. And Elite HRV was developed by extensive research, practice and collaboration with coaches, doctors and HRV researchers. I believe Elite HRV is the most widely used, top-rated HRV application. And Jason, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Ellie. I really appreciate you reaching out and inviting me, and also for fitting this in, with all of the things that you've got going on as well.
No, excellent. Thank you. And one of the reasons I actually got you on today was because HRV readings have actually been a big influence in my life and really changed the way I train, and for the absolute better. And I'll get into that more. But before we get started, there are some people out there who have heard of HRV, not quite sure what it is. Can you go into just a bit of an explanation of what heart rate variability actually is and what we're actually measuring?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So heart rate variability is a little bit different from heart rate, which most people are familiar with. It's measuring the actual variation between each of your heartbeats. And we're looking at really tiny changes like millisecond changes between heartbeats because contrary to popular belief, or maybe it's not that popular belief anymore, is that the heart kind of beats like a metronome, just, faster when you're exercising, slower when you're resting. But really, each and every beat kind of differs. And we're looking for specific patterns in those changes that then indicate changes in your autonomic nervous system, which is part of the nervous system that interacts with almost all of the automatic processes in the body. And specifically, processes that we're usually interested in are the processes that relate to the stress response and also to recovery from stress. So that's kind of a nutshell.
Okay, so the autonomic nervous system that you refer to, that like just in simple terms, would that be the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems?
Yeah, so the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, so to speak, are branches of the autonomic nervous system. Basically, in the sympathetic side is what your body activates in response to stress, usually, although it can be the other way around. And then the parasympathetic side is usually the most dominant player in the recovery process. So certain patterns of HRV indicate more sympathetic activation or sympathetic use dominance, and then other patterns indicate more parasympathetic kind of rest and digest recovery patterns typically.
We get a reading and that reading tells us whether we're imbalance or need to rest or need to recover a bit more or we're ready to train. How does doing the HRV reading actually help us?
Actually, doing one HRV reading in isolation is it gives you a ballpark of generally where things may be. Like if you're, very out of shape or very in shape, so to speak. But one reading in isolation actually doesn't give you a lot of decision-making power. So where the power comes is if you take multiple HRV readings over time, and typically we recommend like once a morning for like 2 minutes or so. And I can go into that in a little more detail if you want, but basically what we end up doing is establishing a pattern of HRV over time for each individual person. And so your pattern might be a little different than my pattern, and the app kind of learns what each individual's pattern typically looks like. And then on subsequent readings, it can tell you when you're deviating from that pattern. And that can be a really good indication of how your training is affecting you, or if you're somebody who's just sick and trying to recover or recovering from an injury, or tons of different things that affect the stress and recovery systems. So whatever the largest stressor and recovery activator in your life is typically what registers most. So from an athlete point of view, assuming that you don't have like a ton of other issues, usually training will be the largest kind of stimulus that your body's experiencing on a regular basis. And then a lot of your nutrition and sleep and active recovery techniques will be going towards mitigating the damage from that training, and then also, of course, then super compensating and improving over time. And HRV will kind of react to training both on an acute level, meaning like, well, definitely acute, like in the moment of training, but the morning after or the couple mornings after, you'll see some variations. And if you're a more advanced athlete and you train once a day or twice a day or 5+ times a week, for example, then you'll be looking for slightly different patterns than somebody who is kind of just off the couch, starting a couch to 5K program or just training for the first time in years or something like that. So those daily fluctuations will typically be a little smaller, but the weekly load and the monthly load will be kind of where you'd focus there. That was kind of a big dump, and I kind of just went off on all the different tangents there, but let me know if you want me to explain any of that further.
Yeah, no, that's quite clear. So just to recap then, there's no point in comparing your HRV number as such with someone else's number. It's more about collecting data for a period of time and then seeing your patterns and seeing how your patterns vary between, say, day to day, week to week, month to month. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, there is some point to comparing to others. So like it kind of gives you a ballpark of where you are on the spectrum. So typically HRV tracks pretty well with biological age. The more you age, typically over time, HRV will go down. And that's an important thing to mention, is that, first of all, there's a bunch of different values that fall under the umbrella of HRV, but we'll just use it as a blanket term. And generally, more HRV correlates with better recovery and also better health and better fitness and things like that. So generally, that's the case.
So generally then, higher HRV means generally, and not always, but basically that you're fitter, healthier, more sort of ready to go.
Exactly, yeah.
And so just to recap then with the HRV, how that's calculated. The way that the HRV is actually calculated, I know, is quite intense, and you've got some good algorithms to handle that. So, but my understanding is that that's calculated on the RMSSD, the root mean square of successive differences. And then no one needs to worry about that because you guys actually transform that into a number out of 100. Is that the way you do it?
Exactly, yeah. The root mean square of successive differences is the calculation at the core of our score. And then we apply a natural log to that, and then we generate that, or we extend that out to that 1 to 100 score that you were just talking about. And that gives you your kind of a score for a specific reading. And then we also have the 1 to 10 kind of readiness score that analyzes patterns in that 1 to 100 score for you and kind of isolates like averages and standard deviations and things to come up with a degree of readiness based on how much that score fluctuates over time. So that's kind of one of the things over the years as we've kind of developed the platform is how do you communicate a potentially really complex value, depending, of course, some mathematicians out there might be like, this is simple, but really it's complex, and then making a meaningful enough for somebody who doesn't want to get into running a bunch of calculations themselves. And that's kind of where our 1 to 10 readiness score came about, and our gauge that you would see in the app that kind of indicates lean towards parasympathetic or sympathetic.
So we'll get more into the readiness score because I'm really interested to talk to you about that, because for me, I get this number out of 100 and I sort of don't really concentrate on it too much, because what I'm more concerned about is, hey, am I ready to train today, or am I not so good? Do I need to just rest and recover a bit more? So I look at that readiness score. But just before we go into the readiness score, that number out of 100, you said typically is higher if you're younger and fitter and that sort of thing. I think you mentioned in one of your podcasts that your average is around 59, 60 for your users.
Yep, we're around 60. And then we also have a demographic chart that I was going to pull up maybe in the background that kind of lays out different age ranges that are typical. So if you want me to end up reading that out loud or something, just let me know.
Maybe we could attach that in the show notes. Would that be all right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll send you a link to it and we can attach it there.
That'd be great because I know most of our listeners are fairly competitive and will want to make sure that they're at the higher end of that HRV number. But in saying that, I assume that your clients typically, and I'm guessing here, but are probably fairly young and fit. Would that be right?
Yeah, it actually started out definitely where the majority of our users were on the younger end. Well, I say that, but maybe 20s, 30s, actually lots of 30 and around 40 kind of age bracket athletes. And over the years, actually, we've got a vastly increasing number of people just trying to manage health and even chronic disease and other conditions on the platform. So we're doing like a lot of demographic analysis right now to kind of just drill in and kind of separate that out so that it can be a little bit more goal specific and fitness level specific and all that stuff. But we've got a pretty wide range, but definitely, I mean, we have Olympic athletes, pro, world champ, endurance and power sports, all the full spectrum, all the way down to depression and psychiatry patients and everything in between.
In that respect, then, the average is sort of a bit hard to gauge at this stage then, really, if you're comparing sort of two ends of the spectrum.
One of the things we include in that link that I'll send you is there's kind of population studies that have been published on different populations, 20-year-old soccer players, for example, and they have some kind of normative values for those, and we've got those linked in there as well. And then we have our population wide on our whole platform, which is probably the largest, unless somebody's hiding a database bigger than ours somewhere. It's probably the largest database of HRV data on the planet. And trying to figure out, okay, here's the age range averages, and then can we drill in on those and be a little more specific? But what I find, at least, is we do get a lot of high performance athletes that will send me an email and say, hey, like, I'm really fit, but I'm below average in my age range. And it's like, well, there's a lot of things that go into your HRV value, and it is impacted by more than just fitness. I'm sure somebody could understand that it's possible to be really fit, but also have issues. So like digestive issues or sleep issues or breathing issues or whatever it is, stress of being a high performance athlete and having a day job and having a family, for example. There's a lot of different things that people juggle. So you can get to fairly good fitness levels and also have other issues. And usually that's kind of a sign that unless you take some measures to mitigate that accumulation of stress, that somewhere down the road, something's going to give and you'll likely get an injury or burn out or just be more addicted to stimulants or whatever it is down the road that can happen. But yeah, I just wanted to let folks know that just because you're fit doesn't necessarily mean you'll be at the high end of the range, depending on what else you've got going on.
Well, that's what I love about it, because it takes into consideration your whole picture without you influencing it. So you can sort of have a hard day at work and go, no, I'm all right. Like, I haven't trained, so I'm ready to train. And then hang on, your readiness score tells you you're like 5 out of 10 and you really just need to rest. Despite whether you mentally thinking that you're ready to train because you haven't trained much, or your actually body, or in this case, autonomic nervous system saying, actually, no, you need to sleep, not train.
Once you really start digging into it, that is kind of like the start of the decision-making process. Then you can kind of really refine it, because maybe it's Friday and maybe typically on Friday you go have a couple alcoholic beverages or something, and then you train before that or whatever it is. But if you really want to prioritize your performance and you're getting that 5 yellow score, you might say, well, I really need to train, and I can rest over the weekend, I'll probably do better, or I will be able to better prioritize my resources if I don't add the additional stress of drinking alcohol on top of that. It might be kind of, I know that's like a really rational, non-emotional way of thinking about things, but it's not that easy always. It might give you some objective data to better make those decisions.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. An example where I've had two really amazing experiences with HRV is one, I was training for a cycling event and it came up to a Thursday. I woke up Thursday morning and I'll be honest, I felt really bad. I feel like I'm fairly intuitive and can guess what my HRV is going to be, but it's great to have that data just to actually scientifically prove how I'm feeling. And so I woke up Thursday morning and it was a fairly intense training session that my coach had for me. And then Friday was going to be a rest day. So I was thinking mentally, yeah, look, I'll be fine. I'll get through it. And then I get to rest on Friday. And I had a look at what was involved, and even that made me a bit worried. And then my HRV reading was like really low. And obviously it was an accumulation of physical stress, I think, from the hard sessions before that. And so what I did is instead of training hard that day, I actually changed my rest day around. So I ended up doing that hard hit session on the Friday. I just felt amazing. So on the Friday morning, I woke up, felt great, had a readiness score of 10 out of 10. And I just know that that decision was such a good one for me, and it made the session actually worthwhile.
Oh, yeah, perfect. It's great. It's great when everybody knows if they've exercised on a day when everything just lines up and feels great. It's like you could push yourself. You don't have to worry so much about overdoing it or getting injured. Of course, you don't want to be ridiculous or something, but it just feels good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's great. As we were talking offline, I recently had an unfortunate bicycle accident which knocked me around a fair bit. It was only a week ago, but it involved surgery on my shoulder and had some head injuries from landing sort of on my shoulder and head. And obviously the impact of the actual incident itself plus the surgery, you got to assume that you're not feeling so great. I couldn't wait to do my HRV, and unfortunately I know I normally do it religiously every morning, but there was a couple of days there where I wasn't quite able to get the heart rate monitor on to do it. After I got out of hospital to do it, I had about 3 or 4 days in between, but then I did it. And my HRV readings for the following 3 or 4 days were the lowest. I've never even hit those numbers. They were 2, 3, and 4, the readiness scores. That just made me think, oh my gosh, this really works. Of course, I'm not in a state to train. It's amazing how it picks that up.
It's a pretty sensitive indicator, and it is amazing. We get anecdotes like that all the time now that we have a lot of communication going, whether it's injury and surgery or whether it's pulling late nights at work for several days in a row. So there's a rehabilitation clinic that has been using our platform to monitor their work-related injury patients. And I think I mentioned this before. Basically, they got to the point where their goal is to fully rehabilitate these people, physical rehabilitation, physical therapy, within a year. And they've got to the point where they can basically predict whether the person's going to pass their rehabilitation criteria within like a couple weeks of just getting their HRV score up front. Because basically the people who go into it where their HRV score crashes or is just incredibly low, because they don't typically have like before values for these people. If they start out at a really low HRV and then the HRV doesn't respond at all to the initial therapy, then it's a really good indicator that they likely will not reach their full recovery within a year. And then there's people who either start out low and respond well and it increases with time. It just doesn't start out incredibly low. And these people, like work-related injury, they're typically not athletes and potentially not the healthiest to start out with. The low numbers are pretty low, but it is interesting to see.
So, Jason, would it be possible then to train their HRV?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So one of the typical ways of directly training your nervous system is through guided breathing techniques and meditation type techniques. So biofeedback is a term that people may have heard of, and it typically means using some kind of tool or measure to get feedback from your body and then gain conscious control over a process that normally is considered unconscious. Heart rate variability is an example of that. Normally, if I tell somebody, try to make your heart less variable, they're going to look at me with like confusion, or try to make it more variable, right? If you follow certain breathing patterns, this is a really interesting experiment. You can measure your HRV just sitting calmly, doing nothing, and then measure it again, but following a specific breathing pattern, and you'll see a drastic change in your HRV. Hands down, I don't know anyone yet to date that does not see a change. Typically, HRV goes up when you follow like a pattern that is diaphragmatic, kind of meaning like you're breathing from your belly area and less from your chest and shoulders, and then emphasizing that exhale, so long, slow exhales, which those types of breathing patterns aren't really what people would normally do day to day. I mean, some people do who've trained it. Many people breathe very shallowly, and we can talk more about that. But essentially, you can use the biofeedback from HRV and doing different things, and breathing is just one of them, to see what triggers an increase in your score. There's a lot of debate on whether or not that has any long-term benefit. So like breathing example. So let's say you do like 5 breaths or something, and it takes like a minute or 2, or a little less time than that. And you see HRV jump up, then you just go back to your normal life and breathe like really shallow, and your HRV goes back down. Was there any benefit to that deep breathing session? Well, maybe so, maybe not. So what I tell people is definitely there's some psychological benefit to stopping and taking moments like that. So whether or not you're like creating lasting nervous system effect directly from that is debatable. There's definite benefits, and long-term increases in HRV have been shown from meditative practices, mindfulness practices, and integrating breathing patterns. But then what I tell people is, well, now you know that you have a way of objectively impacting your recovery, your stress levels. It's an objective feedback showing, yes, you really can affect these things just by paying attention and doing a bit of breathing. So now that's encouragement to integrate that practice into your daily life here and there. And that can definitely have benefits over much more than just doing it once a week or something like that. If you're able to get to the point where at work every couple hours, or whenever between meetings or between clients or something, if you just have a chance to kind of reset yourself and take a few deep breaths and stuff like that, you kind of get some objective feedback saying, yes, I am actually tilting the balance of my nervous system, which sounds kind of crazy if you think about it. Yeah, it's pretty neat to get that feedback.
That's great. And I encourage listeners to perhaps implement a breathing exercise technique practice into their daily lives. See how over time your HRV perhaps goes up. I dare say it will. And there's obviously a lot of biofeedback studies out there that show that, as you said, meditation and breathing does increase it. It'd be good to get people out there to do a couple of N=1 experiments on that. Another sort of question I had around how you measure the HRV. I notice on your app you've got the ability to be able to enter or not some extra information. So, for example, every morning it'll ask you how much sleep you had, and you can give a thumbs down or a thumbs up, or it's just an even sort of thumb as to whether it was good quality sleep. And in the same way, you also offer the ability to put in how much exercise, how many hours of exercise you did that day before, and to what intensity that was. Do you take those figures into consideration when you give someone their HRV score or their readiness score?
No. Basically, the thought behind that is there's a lot of interest in calculating readiness scores and things like that in the market now. And there's different ways of being able to calculate it. One, you could easily say, okay, if you slept less and you perceive the sleep to be of poor quality, then more likely you're less ready to handle stress, right? That's probably a fairly safe line of thought. However, it's not always true, and it's not always true based on the individual and their circumstances, their experience level, their normal sleep patterns. There's so many factors. The reason why we focus on calculate readiness only off of the heart rate variability value itself, because that gives you an objective look, regardless of how sleep was, regardless of nutrition or whatever, or training or work stress or relationships, whatever it is that's impacting you, HRV will pick it up objectively. On one hand, you could even say, like, if you have control like that, where I can input sleep, it impacts my readiness score. Well, then psychologically now I have like some influence on my readiness score.
I thought you were going to say that, but the reason I like the fact that you've got that in there is it actually just reminds me, hang on, I'm entering 6 hours here. So regardless of what my readiness score says to a certain extent, I need more sleep today.
Yes.
And it sort of makes you acknowledge that.
Yep. And we put it in a very specific place in the app. So when we originally implemented it, we knew it was not going to impact the scores, but we also wanted the score to not impact what you put, so that you could objectively track both. And so that's why what we do is we prompt you to take the HRV reading first, and then before you can see your results, you put in your tags for sleep and exercise and whatever else you want to track. And then you get to see both of them afterwards. So.
Excellent. No, that's very smart. So I think you've convinced our listeners absolutely as to why you should measure HRV, especially the athletes out there, but I think just anyone in general, just to know, what you can handle for the day and then look at those patterns over time. I was personally sold on Elite HRV. I know there's a few competitors out there, but I had a look at those and I was sort of firstly sold because of who was using your app, like Chris Kelly and the Rob Wolfs out there. I know are keen advocates, and there's many others. But why should our listeners choose Elite HRV?
Some of it comes down to personal preference, but I like to think that we do a really good job of continuously evolving over time. So we weren't the first app out there, and we quickly caught up to and passed all of the other apps in number of users and reviews and all of that stuff. Not because I'm just such a nice and good-looking guy or something. It's
I think it's because your wife's so pretty.
Oh, that's what it is. I actually have thought about changing the app icon to her face, but another story. So really, though, I think it kind of comes back to, we treat this business the same way as we would use HRV anyways, which is we gather feedback from our user base. What are they doing out in the field? Who are you on the front lines, and what are you doing? And how can we adapt the system to be more useful to you and more effective? And also, we're keeping a really big tap on emerging research and different ways of analyzing our data to kind of refine it and make it more useful to people. It kind of helps that I have a background in large-scale data system and analysis, system design from the oil and gas job that you mentioned at the beginning, where basically taking like complex data from a number of sources and organizing it in such a way that makes for better decision making. That on the platform side, I think really helps. And then on the kind of experience of our team side, we are, I like to think at least, very holistic in the way that we approach things. So I've mentioned a bunch of times in this episode, it could be nutrition, or it could be psychology, it could be exercise, all these different things. Well, we try to stay pretty well steeped to the best of our ability in all of those areas and how they all link together and kind of the most effective methods of improving those, so that we can then convey those and just add a lot of value to our users. People could say that they try to do that as well, but I think we do a pretty good job of it.
I had a few questions just personally about my readings for HRV. So I put in a question on your website or on one of your blogs, and you answered really well. And you also gave me links to different things that I might be interested in. And it was an amazing response. And to be honest, I didn't expect that sort of level of service. So that was another thing that excited me about using Elite HRV. And then you also mentioned that you're continually analysing feedback and new studies and that sort of thing, and you're continuously evolving What's on the horizon for you guys? Are there any add-on apps or anything that you're looking at adapting?
Yes, definitely. So 2017 is going to be a big year for us. Yeah, we often get the question, how do you make money? Because the app is free and it has no ads in it. Well, to put that to bed, we do charge for a team coach subscription, but 2017 will see a lot more premium features coming out. One of our goals is to have I guess another good reason to choose our app is that it's free, and a lot of other systems are not. And our goal is to keep the free version of our app better than the paid alternatives, and then also add premium features on top of that will add additional value. So people will see in the coming months a lot more in-depth analysis for those that want it, slice and dice the data in different ways, as well as other metrics, because I know that our audience is keen on tracking a lot of different things: blood glucose, ketones, power output, lots of training related markers. And that'll all be in there, and then also more in an analyzable format so that you can very visually see how variables affect each other and how they affect heart rate variability. So in a sense, it'll be more of a complete kind of self-quantification platform using HRV as a cornerstone. And then we have a lot of stuff down the pipeline, but that's probably going to take us through the summer.
That's sort of what I'm on the search for, is one of those apps that integrate everything. And it sounds like that's the way you're heading, which is really exciting. I guess this is a bit of a tricky thing to do, but is there any chance that eventually that you'll even integrate things like your actual training itself and a bit more specific training? So say, for example, a cross between what you're looking at doing and, say, Training Peaks.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, where it makes sense, though, we try to not reinvent the wheel as possible. So we'll actually be, not this next release, but the release after, we'll have an integration with Training Peaks. And so we'll be integrating with a lot of other apps too in the near future, so that people who already track things in Training Peaks or Strava or various platforms, they'll be able to integrate that in with their HRV data a little bit more easily. In the long term, we may draw a lot of that into our own platform and let people do it all from one place. We'll just have to see. Again, it kind of comes back to that audience feedback, or the feedback from the user base, is kind of get a pulse on what people want next.
And what about, say, on the other end of it, say the Aura Ring or something like that you may use to track your sleep? Would that potentially integrate with something that you're doing?
Yeah, it could. A lot of the integration stuff depends. Prior to now, it depended on us because we didn't have time to do it. But after we open our doors for integration, a lot of it will just depend on other companies and what they want to do as well. Some people that come out, I'm not saying that Aura Ring is this way or anything, but many companies who come out with hardware try to keep a closed ecosystem and don't really like to send their data outside of their ecosystem because they, want to make money on both ends, or whatever the reason is. As far as hardware goes and integrating with various things like Aura Ring, a lot of that will just depend on the company themselves. But we're also looking at different hardware options ourselves to see if we can expand our offering a little bit more. Got some promising things on the horizon for that.
Well, it sounds like you're not going to tell us yet, but that sounds really exciting. And look, one thing we didn't really talk about today, although you mentioned it, it is a free app, but for teams, and this is where you're making your money at the moment, is like coaches can actually purchase your app and look at the teams. And we won't go into that today, but I will link to an excellent podcast you did with Alex Fergus. He's an amazing online coach as well. And I know he's a big advocate of Elite HRV, and he goes into detail about how he actually uses that for his clients. Now, we've got a fair few coaches out there listening, so they might be interested in listening to that podcast.
Alex is a very sharp guy and high-performing athlete himself. Lots of great info in that.
To touch back onto a personal experience I had with Elite HRV, I knew I wanted to do it, but it's one of those things that, another thing you've got to add to your life. Gosh, this is going to be, when am I going to find time to do this? I couldn't believe how easy it was. On your site, you've got the heart rate monitors that are able to be used and not. It's very easy. I just use one of the Polar ones, very easy. Strap it on every morning. Reminder readiness app pops up. It takes 2 minutes or just over, you're done. I just do it first thing because obviously you don't want anything to influence your reading. And it's just a really easy habit to put into your daily schedule.
We try to make it as easy as possible. People often ask, maybe if they didn't hear a podcast or something like that, they say, oh, do I have to monitor this all 24/7 all day, every day? And it's like, no. I mean, if you did that, you may get some slightly marginal more benefit of decision making, but the inconvenience would far outweigh the benefit. So you can get so much of the benefit just doing 2 minutes each morning, and you really get an in-depth look at what's going on in that short time.
Absolutely. Look, thank you very much. I think we've covered a lot, and I know our listeners out there can ask you anything, can ask questions on our podcast, and we'll get back to them. We'll link to your websites and how people can get the app and all of that sort of thing. And Jason, just before you go, there's a question that we like to ask all our guests, and it's a bit random, nothing to do with anything, but tells us a bit about you. And that is, do you have a tattoo?
Oh, no, I don't.
You don't? Well, that's interesting because the last guest didn't either, which is quite surprising in this day and age. So a follow-up question from that would be, why not? And if you were to get one, what would it be?
That's a good question. Yeah, actually, Alyssa, my wife, and I talk about this a lot, is that almost everybody has a tattoo these days, and neither of us do. I suppose it's just I'm a pretty simple person. It's just minimal overall. Yeah, basically, I don't really own a lot of clothes. I don't own a lot of things. Not to say that I'm like living in a cave somewhere or anything, but yeah, I'm just fairly minimal. And I like to spend a lot of my time learning and doing things, but not saying that people with tattoos don't do that. But anyways, yeah, so what would it be? That's a good question. Seen some good tattoos. A friend of mine had her parents died and she got their signatures on her feet. I thought it was kind of like really symbolic about them guiding her steps throughout life. Those types of tattoos I definitely understand.
So maybe you get a big Elise signature on your foot.
Yes, there you go. I tattoo my wife's name on my forehead.
You have to say that, right?
Yeah, I do a lot of rock climbing, or a fair amount. I have this little like silicone safety ring, which I had bought a long time ago, not for rock climbing, but I totally forget about it because my wedding ring, it's like soft and bendy, and I'm never going to go back to a metal one because it's so much more comfortable. A guy at the rock climbing gym told me I should not be wearing it rock climbing, and he had a good point. And then he said he got one tattooed on, although he's divorced now, so.
One of those tattoos that you wish you never had.
Right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jason, and I'm sure that our listeners really appreciated you coming on today. So thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate it. And great questions, great discussion, and sounds like you have a great audience that's very in tune to stuff. So I look forward to hearing their thoughts.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.